Let us go. Blessed is the man that walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor standeth in the way of sinners, nor sitteth in the seat of the scornful. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law doth he meditate day and night. And he shall be like a tree planted by the rivers of water, that bringeth forth his fruit in his season. His leaf also shall not wither, and whatsoever he doeth shall prosper. The ungodly are not so, but are like the shaft which the wind driveth away. Therefore the ungodly shall not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous. For the Lord knoweth the way of the righteous, but the way of the ungodly shall perish. This afternoon we are looking at Psalm 1 verse 6. For the Lord knoweth the way of the righteous, but the way of the ungodly shall perish. And we're going to begin by looking at a vision that Ellen White had. And a vision that really had me thinking about these two ways that are placed before us at times. And it says, I want you to pay attention to what she saw. At the conference at Battle Creek, May 27, 1856, I was shown in vision some things that concern the church generally. The glory and majesty of God were made to pass before me, said the angel. He is terrible in his majesty, yet we realize it not. Terrible in his anger, yet ye offend him daily. Strive to enter in at the strait gate. For wide is the gate, and broad is the way that leadeth to destruction. And many there be which go in thereat, because strait is the gate, and narrow is the way which leadeth unto life. And few there be that find it. You remember that Psalm chapter 1 verse 6 is talking about the way of the righteous and the way of the ungodly. She identifies both ways here. These roads are, what are those words? They are distinct, separate in opposite directions. One leads to eternal life, the other to eternal death. Now these roads are distinct, separate in opposite directions. One leads to eternal life, the other to eternal death. I saw the distinction between these roads, also the distinction between the companies traveling them. The roads are opposite. One is broad and smooth, the other narrow and rugged. So the parties that travel them are opposite in character, in life, in dress, and in conversation. Those who travel in the narrow way are talking of the joy and happiness they will have at the end of the journey. Their countenances are often sad, yet often beam with holy, sacred joy. They do not dress like the company in the broad road, nor talk like them, nor act like them. A pattern has been given them. A man of sorrow and acquainted with grief opened that road for them and traveled it himself. His followers see his footsteps and are comforted and cheered. He went through safely, so can they if they follow in his footsteps. I saw many traveling, and this is what I want you to pay attention to. I saw many traveling in this broad road, who had the words written upon them, dead to the world. Which road were there? Which road did they travel on? Right, but they had written upon them what? Dead to the world. The end of all things is at hand. Be ye also ready. Are those words found on the broad road? They looked just like the vain ones around them, except a shade of sadness which I noticed upon their countenances. Their conversation was just like that of the gay, thoughtless ones around them, but they would occasionally point with great satisfaction to the letters on their garments, calling for the others to have the same upon theirs. They were in the broad road, yet they professed to be of the number who were traveling the narrow way. Those around them would say, there is no distinction between us. We are alike. We dress and talk and act alike. So should there be a distinction, a separation that we talked about between one road and the other? Which road do you think the education system that we are to follow is found on? The narrow road. Our education system given to us by God is found on the narrow road. It should be opposite in character to the education system on the broad road. Let us see how it is said. In our institutions of learning, there was to be exerted an influence that will counteract the influence of the world and give no encouragement. Sorry, I did not say where the vision was taken from. Testimonies, Volume 1, page 128.2. Our next quote is taken from Fundamentals of Christian Education 286.1. It says, in our institutions of learning, there was to be exerted an influence that would counteract the influence of the world and give no encouragement to indulgence in appetite, in selfish gratification of the senses, in pride, ambition, love of dress and display, love of praise and flattery, and strive for high rewards and honors as a recompense for good scholarship. We discussed all these things. Can you imagine a school that has none of these things in them? It's not what we have grown up thinking education to be. All this was to be discouraged in our schools. It would be impossible to avoid these things and yet send them to the public schools, where they would daily be brought in contact with that which would contaminate their morals. All through the world, there was so great a neglect of proper home training that the children found at the public schools, for the most part, were profligate and steep in vice. Now this week we outlined a few principles that should guide our educational choice. I think most people understood the choices that were placed before us. But I just did a simple table, and I think most of you were able to get that table in a little booklet. You all got a little booklet on the education system? Right. At the back of that booklet, you have a table that nicely gives an idea of the two systems. Now, I only put the beginning and the end of it there, but we will fill in the blanks. Let's see, anyone got a chance to read the booklet at all? No? Glance at the booklet? No? Okay. We are looking at two separate education plans. One found on the broad road, one found on the narrow road. One would eventually lead to the mark of the beast, and the other, the seal of God. One is Egyptian, one is godly. The distinctions between them extend. When you get home, open the booklet and go to the back of it. You will see that under God's education plan, you have individuality, originality, independence of thought and action. Contrast that with the system that develops class distinction, aristocracy, imperialism, all those things that are considered common in today's world. There's also the contrast. One prepares you for unselfish service. Which one is that? God's education plan will prepare you for unselfish service. On the other side, you will only be fulfilling selfish desires. In God's education plan, you have a little number of books. What do you think happens on the other side? Large numbers of textbooks, important books that must be bought. Under God's education plan, you have the possibility of short courses of training. What happens on the other side? Long courses of training. One has simple infrastructure with small connected areas. The other has huge buildings with one or two main areas. You all are getting the distinctions we outlined during the week? One has its emphasis on natural science. The other has its emphasis on, what's the biggie in universities these days? Humanities. The new form of science called social science. Yes, not science in its true form. One has the emphasis on the balance of physical and mental. The other is book-oriented. You see the distinctive clash that's happening there? One will allow you to read sacred writings. The other will make it compulsory for you to read heathen classics. One will allow you to question and understand. The other says, let's memorize, let's do rote memory, let's learn and regurgitate in an exam. One will allow you to move by faith, the other by sight. One produces holy Protestant action. The other produces pagan, papal thought. One allows all their students to develop in an all-round fashion. The other one will give you a prize for outstripping another student. One completes Christ in you, and the other allows you to compete. One will tell you that manual labor is the best. The other one will say, let's play sports and games. One would have an elective system, that is where you have a choice. The other one will allow you only to follow a prescribed course of study. You must do these credits in order to graduate. One promotes self-governance, and the other has a constant system of supervision and monitoring. Do you know in some of our schools when they started, there was little need for dorm supervision? There were dorms, but the students were taught how the concept of self-governance. And so obedience wasn't a matter of if someone was looking, but the fact that the Lord is always looking at what you're doing. Now, the other few contrasting points you can check out in your handout, but there's one I need to say for sure. One is self-supporting. What is the opposite of that? One is state-funded. And that is why at the end of the day, you either produce a willing, blind, obedient servant who waits for the next command. Put this there. So, and the other one, it produces a person who has the freedom of choice. Someone can think and choose for themselves. Wasn't that what God gave us in the first place? Wasn't that what he gave to Eve? At the risk of her doing exactly what she did? That is what we are left with at the end. And this is where we are. This is the problem at the end of all that knowing. To live in the world and yet be not of the world is a problem that many professed Christians have never worked out in their practical life. It is nice to say it. It is nice to see it in the Bible. But how does that translate into our practical life? How do we in the world but not of the world? Now let's look at the best example that I can give you for this. Let's look at Jesus. Fundamentals of Christian Education 439.1 says, the brothers and sisters of Jesus were taught the multitude of traditions and ceremonies of the rabbis. But Christ himself could not be induced to interest himself in these matters. While hearing on every hand the reiterated thou shalt and thou shalt not, he moved independently of these restrictions. The requirements of society and the requirements of God were ever in collision. And while in his youth, he made no direct attack. Now pay attention to this. He made no direct attack upon the customs or precepts of the learned teachers. He just did what? He did not become a student in their schools. Let's finish our quote. Jesus would not follow any custom that would require him to depart from the will of God, nor would he place himself under the instruction of those who exalted the words of men above the word of God. He shut out of his mind all the sentiments and formalities that had not God for their foundation. He would give no place for these things to influence him. Thus he taught, and this is important, that it is better to prevent evil than to attempt to correct it after it has gained a foothold in the mind. And most adults will tell you, if you have a chance to start with a fresh little one, it is much easier than trying to correct all the wrongs that we may have been exposed to. And Jesus would not, by his example, lead others to place themselves where they would be corrupted, nor would he needlessly place himself in a position where he would be brought into conflict with the rabbis, which might in after years result in weakening his influence with the people. For the same reason, he could not be induced to observe the meaningless forms or rehearse the maxims that afterwards in his ministry he so decidedly condemned. So as we live in this world today, we have to take the advice in that much quoted text, Jeremiah 10, 2, 8, and 15. Remember Jeremiah 10 says, learn not the way of the heathen. Learn not the way of the heathen. Jeremiah calls it brutish and foolish, a stuff and a doctrine of vanities. Let's just read it. Jeremiah 10. Let's read that text. Jeremiah chapter 10. You can read the entire chapter at home, but we would only look at verses 2, 8, and 15. It says, "Thus saith the Lord, learn not the way of the heathen, and be not dismayed at the signs of the heaven, for the heathen are dismayed at them, but they are altogether," verse 8, "but they are altogether brutish and foolish. The stuff is a doctrine of vanities. They are vanity and the work of errors. In the time of their visitation," verse 15, "they shall perish." Do you know that the injunction that God gave all Israel is the same for Israel today? It says in Education, page 49.1, "The discipline and training that God appointed for Israel will cause them in all their ways of life to differ from the people of other nations." Do we see modern Israel being different from all other nations around us? This peculiarity, which should have been regarded as a special privilege and blessing, was to them unwelcome. The simplicity and self-restraint essential to the highest development they sought to exchange for the pomp and self-indulgence of the heathen peoples. To be like all the nations was their ambition. God's plan of education was set aside, his authority disowned. Are we setting aside the education plan of God today? Because once we do so, Spirit of Prophecy says in Education, page 50.1, once you put aside God's plan of education, Israel begins to fall. It begins to fall. Any education system and any nation not following the principles of God will fall. You remember in Nebuchadnezzar's image? Did each kingdom fall? They're not here today. Each kingdom fell in its turn, simply because it disregarded God. And I'm going to give you just a few clips to establish this, but you can go read it for yourself. YI, September 22nd, 1903, paragraph 2. The image revealed to Nebuchadnezzar, while representing the deterioration of the kingdoms of the earth in power and glory, also fitly represents the deterioration of religion and morality among the people of these kingdoms. Remember we spoke about education and the corresponding morality that accompanies it? It deteriorates. As nations forget God, in like proportion they become weak morally. The same thing is said about Babylon. Babylon passed away because in her prosperity she forgot God and ascribed the glory of her prosperity to what? Human achievement, the brilliance of man. Look at the Medo-Persian kingdom. It was visited by the wrath of heaven because in this kingdom God's law was trampled underfoot. The fear of the Lord found no place in the hearts of the people. The prevailing influence in Medo-Persia were wickedness, blasphemy, and corruption. And then it says, the kingdoms that followed were even more base and corrupt. This is the product of what kind of education? These were worldly kingdoms, right? So it was a product of worldly education. They deteriorated because they cast off their allegiance to God. As they forgot him, they sank lower and still lower in the scale of moral value. Now, I'm emphasizing this because often we think that we can somehow appease God by splicing in a little religion into the system, but not have a system exactly after his order. Change it for me, please. The vast empire of Rome crumbled to pieces, and from its ruin rose that mighty power, the Roman Catholic Church. This church boasts of her infallibility and her hereditary religion, but this religion is a horror to all who are acquainted with the secrets of the mystery of iniquity. The priests of this church maintain their ascendancy by keeping the people in ignorance of God's will So if you are being kept in ignorance of God's will in regards to something, you're practicing what kind of authority? Roman authority. You're being kept in ignorance of God's will as revealed in the scriptures. Now, the thing is, when you get to study the history, the raw history of our Seventh Adventist, primary, secondary, and tertiary level schools, I was actually able to live through and see one on the decline. When you study their histories, you will come to the very same conclusion. A rejection of the educational ways of God results in their downfall. We have established a number of schools all over the world, and all of them started off as God had prescribed. Started off giving our children a means of being educated in the name of Christ. But what happens over time? Now most of our prestigious schools are what? Mere shadows, right? Of what they intended to be. They suddenly were subject to accreditation demands. And they had to keep up with accreditation demands and requirements that stack ever so high every 4 or 5 years. They're more in line with the worldly institution and governmental requirements and the express command of God. How diligent do you see a staff on one of our schools preparing for accreditation ratings? Is the same diligence put towards getting the approval of God? We were warned in the work of educating the youth in our schools, it would be a difficult matter to retain the influence of God's Holy Spirit and at the same time hold fast to erroneous principles. Fundamentals of Christian Education 167.1. Now, in history, this is secular history as well as religious history, this is a proven fact, and this is something I want you to note. Erroneous principles, once planted within our education system, is almost impossible to uproot. You remember the Reformation in Germany? It was a religious reformation, not so? But how did they check it? In the 16th century, when this Reformation blossomed in Europe, how was it checked? Did they open a church to counteract the church that Luther started? How did they stop the Reformation? It wasn't completed, eh, folks? How did they put that Reformation in check? How did they get in? They set up a school system. To attack the church, they set up a school system. The Jesuits concentrated on becoming teachers, not priests. Teachers. They set up elaborate schools. They were counteracting a religious reformation, but where did they hit? They hit the schools, because the schools feed the church. If you can take over the schools, everyone coming out of that school who's going to take in charge of the churches will be influenced. So think about it, in the 16th century, if the counter-reformation, as we call it, focused on establishing schools, it means that schools are very important. Remember Martin Luther said the Protestant Reformation cannot be maintained without schools. That is why he and Melanchthon established so many schools in Europe that the papacy trembled at its roots. They were eradicating its influence. And they realized that the only way to get rid of the Protestant churches was to infiltrate their schools. So the school systems are very important. The schools are practically the doorways to the churches. And so you find that even in America, where they thought they were getting away from Roman influence, the Jesuits became teachers there. And the same erroneous principles settled in the schools once more. And so people think that when they copy American schools or they copy European schools, they're copying brilliant plans for school designs and school growth and school discipline and all these other things that they copy. But what they're actually copying, they're actually replicating the beast. They're actually replicating the papacy. They're replicating these principles within our children because we were given those principles already. We don't need to go look for it anywhere else. They're simple, and that's the problem some people have. The guidelines for our school system, they're very simple. The simplest, humblest person going to the Bible and spirit of prophecy can figure out how to set up a school. Because our schools were supposed to be small and numerous. But we want complicated. We want books that thick that we have to sit down and read through policies for like 5 days. You're not sleeping because you're trying to make sure everything is in check. We want the complication because it makes it sound important. Remember, the Jesuits infiltrated the schools and the churches. So, knowing all of this, why would some people not want to return to God's system? Why would some people, after they have learned the basics that we did this week, after they've gone and studied on their own the spirit of prophecy and other works that will teach them about our system, why would some people not want to implement what the word of the Lord says? Do you think everyone will want to implement a system like this? Do you think Barbados would now get, should I say this? Would now get a real Adventist school? Do you think it will result in such happening in the places where this knowledge is now being spread? Why not? Do you know that we are simply repeating the Jews? Listen to this. MS 130, 1897, or you can find in My Character and Personality, Volume 1, page 324.1. By his conscience, every honest Jew was convinced that Jesus Christ was the Son of God. So every honest Jew knew that the man they killed was the Son of God. But, so every Adventist, if they are honest, will know that God's education plan is the best for their child. But, the heart in it, pride and ambition would not surrender. They'll tell you, I already planned my son what he's supposed to do, and I invest plenty money in that child, and that child is going to be X, Y, and Z. And the X, Y, and Z sometimes may not be service of God. Because I advise young people to aim high, you know. Aim high. Reach for the highest height you can reach. Soar above. She even tells them to sit on legislative councils and make decisions. Aim high. But in your aiming, keep God as your witness. Keep Him as your guide. So when you get up there, pride and ambition will not pull you down. Now, in their heart, its pride and ambition will not surrender. Any opposition was maintained against the light of truth, which they had decided to resist and deny. Many secretly hold a negative view of the requirements on the narrow path. Look at what Ellen White told some folks once. I am not willing to look on passively and see you go as others have gone in the fatal delusion that Seventh-day Adventists are too narrow in their ideas, are traveling into obscure path, that they must needs have greater notoriety and rise to greater eminence than the teachers in our school, that the teachers in our school should give their powers more exclusively to the sciences and not weave religion into so much of their education. So you should try and be like what? When this seed is dropped into the hearts of students, because parents will say, it's too much Bible. Come on, we got to teach somebody stuff. They say the children in the world have all these books and all these things and they know so much of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And they push the teachers within the schools. Look, this boy in this school doing so and so. Why my son can't do so and so? But it says, when the seed is dropped into the hearts of students, it will develop rapidly into a harvest which you will not covet to reap. Testimonies, Volume 5, page 587. Sadly, some will make the same decision as the Jews of old. Pride and ambition will bear rule, and they will begin to paint the education system of God as too obscure a path, too different, too simple, not giving their children the best, and they'll make all sorts of excuses about the system of education that God has established. They will look at the lofty buildings in the worldly schools and say, but look at the small building that school has. That school can't be better than that one. And they will use worldly standards to compare and make excuses. It is a sad fact that men who have been entrusted with fine capabilities to be employed in the service of God have prostituted their powers in the service of evil and laid their talents at the feet of the enemy. They submitted in the most servile bondage to the prince of evil, while rejecting the service of Christ as humiliating and undesirable. Would you like your child to be like Jesus? Would you like him to be a person who walks around helping people? Think about the life of Jesus, yeah? People slapping him and calling him all kind of names and mistreating him and put it in the practical setting. Would you like your child to be like Jesus? Yes. You You don't have any children as yet. The young man says a resounding yes, but you don't have children. When you do, you would see the attachment and the wish for them. It is a struggle. But do you really wish your child to be like some of those disciples? They were no-name renegades kind of thing, you know. I shouldn't use that word to describe one of Christ's disciples. I do apologize. But they were not like the normal, everyday Jew. They were lowly, they were humble, they were not recognized as grand. Think about it, huh? Let's read the underlying part in Fundamentals of Education, page 170.2. They looked upon the work of the followers of Christ as a work below their ambition. They required a stepping down from their greatness, a species of slavery that would enthrall their powers and narrow their circle of influence. Not grand enough for some people. He who had made an infinite sacrifice that they might be set free from the bondage of evil was set aside as unworthy their best efforts and most exalted service. You see why some people may not want this plan of education? This plan of education would seem to be too self-denying. Many would become a hero and not a doer. They would enjoy learning a lot about Christian education, but doing it, another story. Would a woman leave her quote-unquote good job to ensure that her child spends the first 8 to 9 years at home? Wouldn't other people find that strange? Would parents seek to homeschool their children when no proper SEA schools can be found? Would a person refuse the best of worldly education so that they can attend a simple, true, of no reputation, send them into school? Now this is where hearers of the word must become doers. It's nice to hear. To me, it's dangerous to hear. Because once you hear and you now have to decide. But you know, this is what he said, you would be held accountable for that which you should have. Or that was within your reach to hear. So don't think you stay away from the meetings and don't play the recordings and then you're fine. That doesn't work either. Alright? Being a hearer of the word alone is not sufficient. And my husband loves to say that people treat present truth buffet style. They pick which ones they think they want to reform in. And they want a team too hard, maybe another time. God will understand. But the road is getting narrower and narrower and narrower. The restrictions are getting tighter. Do you all notice that? Okay. You can't be a hearer alone of the word. The seed must take root in order to bear fruit. This is my advice. Prayerfully study. You must study this topic of education on your own. Because when you do that, it will guide you into a path for you and your children. You must make prayerful decisions, and changes must follow. Too many of our children are under the hands of worldly teachers. Unfortunately, sacred history has shown us that the majority would not obey God explicitly. But the Lord always has a remnant, a small amount who will hear his voice and not think it too hard to make the sacrifices asked for. They will step by step follow his plan. Each person who follows his plan would be re-educated. They will be willing to make unpopular decisions. They would be willing to follow the Lamb whithersoever he leadeth. This is an important quote we must look at here. Testimonies, volume 8. And I'm beginning to realize that the testimonies in the church cover, I think sometimes it's everything. I might be wrong in saying that, but sometimes I marvel at what I find in there. Testimonies, volume 8, page 305.1. It says, the mastermind in the confederacy of evil is ever working to keep out of sight the words of God and to bring into full view the opinions of men. He means that we shall not hear the voice of God saying, this is the way, walk ye in it. Through what? Through educational processes, he is doing all in his power to obscure heaven's light. So, when the Jesuits infiltrate the schools in order to block the Reformation. Is it any different to the plan of the enemy? No. The enemy is still trying through educational processes to stop you from seeing what God has in store for you. There are two classes of educators in this world, and this is a small thing that I had to contend with. We talk about educating our children, but those of us who are involved as educators, people who are teachers, lecturers, monitors, tutors, Spirit of Prophecy says, in Fundamentals of Christian Education 174.1, there are two classes of educators in the world. So if you're a teacher, you have to think about it. One class are those whom God makes channels of light, and the other class are those whom Satan uses as his agents. Is there a middle ground there? Should our teachers be in public school pushing these curriculum that the beast has passed down through the UN, through UNESCO, down to the schools? I tell you, it's going to get tough, you know. And if you go home and read all of it, it's going to get even tougher. One class are those whom God makes channels of light, and the other class are those whom Satan uses as his agents, who are wise to do evil. One class contemplates the character of God and increases in the knowledge of Jesus, whom God had sent into the world. This class becomes wholly given up to those things which bring heavenly enlightenment, heavenly wisdom to the uplifting of the soul. Every capability of their nature is submitted to God, and their thoughts are brought into captivity to Christ. The other class is in league with the prince of darkness, who is ever on the alert that he might find an opportunity to teach others the knowledge of evil. If place is made for him, he will not be slow to press his way into heart and mind. And it goes on, page 170.3, the same page going on. These men, that is those who were entrusted with fine capabilities to be employed in the service of God, these men had received their talents from God, and every gem of thought by which they had been esteemed worthy of the attention of scholars and thinkers belonged not to them, but to the God of all wisdom, whom they did not acknowledge. Through tradition, through false education, these men are exalted as the world's educators. Now here's the clincher. But in going to them, students are in danger of accepting the vile with the precious. For superstition, specious reasoning, and error are mingled with the portions of true philosophy and instruction. This mingling makes a portion that is poisonous to the soul, destructive of faith in the God of all truth. Those who have a thirst for knowledge need not go to these polluted fountains. And should we become polluted fountains ourselves? You know how hard it is to try and teach God's principles while teaching some of those syllabus or syllabi, some people say, within a system? There are many stories I can tell you. For they are invited to come to the fountain of life and drink freely. Through searching the word of God, they may find the hidden treasure of truth that has long been buried beneath the rubbish of error, human tradition, and the opinions of men. Let's look at the example everyone enjoys quoting. Who is the example everyone enjoys quoting when they want to talk about going to a Babylonian school? What's the one Bible example we get? What's the example of? Daniel. Daniel and the 3 Hebrew boys. They were given what kind of education? You think? What kind of education they were given? What does the Spirit of Prophecy tell you? What kind of education were they given? That's true. They were given proper Christian education before they got into Babylon. So when they were enslaved and sent into a Babylonian system, were they not able to stand? You know the Wallenses experienced the same thing, right? But in a similar setting. The Wallenses had educated their children in the mountainous areas for years. But by the time they had sent some of them into the universities outside, reading the Spirit of Prophecy, go check out their story. It says they were distinct. Their clothes were different, they behaved different, they did not seek to make friends of the worldlings. They did not become part of anything in their universities. And they were able to carry with them, hidden in their clothes, pieces of scripture that they looked for opportunities to share. So Spiritual Prophecy describes them as missionaries in a worldly school. But sadly enough, if you look at a university today and you scan the campus, can you tell our children from those of the world? If you sit in a classroom, can you tell our children from those of the world? So people like to quote the Waldenses, and people love to quote Daniel in Babylon. But are you sure that when you send your child that they would stand like Daniel? Did you give them the training from birth till that age to make sure they would stand like Daniel? The Waldenses were drilled. By the time those children had hit universities abroad, the Bible was memorized in their brain. Remember we talked about the concept of first introduction? That was their experience. Every word coming out of the professor's mouth had not an earthly meaning. If he had twisted it that way, it just wasn't set that way in their mind. So be careful. Let's look at what it says about Daniel. And I found this, if you have this study Bible, I think it's right there. It says in Fundamentals of Education, there are many among professed Christians today who would decide that Daniel was too narrow and bigoted. What are we talking about here? They actually promote you about the other slaves. They carry the king's court and say, listen, you're going to get the best of Babylon.